Hi, and welcome to class again. Like Gabriel Cotter and Mays, I'm back. Today we're going to talk about the United States and the Middle East, which is a topic of some interest, especially in light of 9/11, wars in Afghanistan, the current war on Iraq, and of course the continuing Israeli-Palestinian crisis. Many of the central issues in 20th century U.S. policy, actually in 20th century world history, have been in the Middle East. It is an area of great importance. It has strategic importance, especially because of the Persian Gulf, the Suez, giving access to the Mediterranean. Political importance, religious significance, Israel, Palestine, the birthplace of modern religions, and of course oil, which one can never understate. And the Middle East has been the site of various crises in the world, which will lead us to September 11th, 2001. What I want to do is kind of do it all, and I don't know how far I'll get. There's a lot to talk about, but I think it's really important. Since 9/11, it's become painstakingly clear that most Americans don't have a deep and profound knowledge of the Middle East, or even basically a fundamental knowledge of the Middle East. And I would certainly include many of the political policymakers in that group. And so I want to talk a little bit about the background today and try to hit the major issues. So we'll do what we do. I want to start early in the 20th century to kind of give just a very brief background of how the current crises emerged at the outset of the 1900s. I'm going to start with your question, or I thought you had a question. Start with the kind of the turn of the century. The Middle East had been under Ottoman rule, Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, from about 1516 to World War I. There's a map of the Ottoman Empire there, modern day Turkey. In the late 19th century in Palestine, which is an area we're going to talk about a lot. In Palestine, there were about 500,000 Arabs and about 25,000 Jews, and that would be in what is today Palestine and Syria. At the same time in Europe, anti-Semitism, which was not uncommon. If you've ever read Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, you're aware that anti-Semitism was particularly strong throughout Europe, basically forever, pogroms and attacks on Jews. In the late 19th century, anti-Semitism was particularly strong. In France, there had been a scandal involving a French officer, a Jewish French officer named Alfred Dreyfus, who was accused of treason with some rigged evidence. And this unleashes a wave of anti-Semitism. And as a result of that, you get the first organized movement for Jews to address their status in Europe and create a unified home area. And the person most associated with this was Theodor Herzl, who was a journalist, and the ideology Herzl spoke for, which was not his creation, was Zionism. And this is something, I can't stress enough. The issue in the Middle East throughout the 20th century, as much as anything, has been Zionism. Zionism, quite simply, is the idea that the oppression of Jews in Europe, all over the world actually, is so great that all Jews all over the world deserve a homeland, their own state, where they can exist independently as a Jewish nation. And the area where it would occur, based on kind of biblical geography, would be Palestine, which obviously is also known as Israel. And in fact, in 1897, a Congress of Zionists met in Basel, Switzerland, and issued a declaration that says the aim of Zionism is to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law, essentially a recognized Jewish state. The World Zionist Organization begins to set up companies to purchase land and send settlers in to Palestine. About 40,000 Jews emigrated. By the beginning of World War I, 40,000 out of a total population of over 700,000. So it is still overwhelmingly an Arab area. When World War I begins, the Ottomans join the Central Powers, which would lead, of course, to their dissolution, the Central Powers being Germany, and the Habsburgs lost. At the same time, the Arabs see this as an opportunity, so you start to see Arab risings against the Ottomans throughout the Middle East. And in fact, in 1915 and 16, an Arab leader, Sharif Hussein, began a series of correspondences with a British Foreign Office official named Sir Henry McMahon. I think that's the way they pronounce it rather than McMahon. And they exchanged letters which appeared to the Arabs to give British support for Arab independence if the Arabs would revolt against the Ottomans. And you do see a series, which are militarily important, of Arab revolts against the Ottomans, which tie down the Turks in World War I. At the same time, however, the British and French sign an agreement, and don't pay too much attention to this map, called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which essentially was big power diplomacy. They were going to divide up the world after World War I. So they're anticipating the dissolution of the Ottomans too. So the British and the French, the blue would be French, the red would be British. It's, that this didn't happen. This was a kind of projected division. So you can see the big powers are rushing in, anticipating that if the Ottomans do fall apart, they want to grab the Middle East too. There's not a whole lot of oil yet. I mean, this is still real early in the kind of oil empire days, but everybody's aware that there's something going on there. And in addition to that, it's important as a route, as trade routes through the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Aqaba is there, and of course Suez, which gives you access to the Mediterranean. So everybody's aware the Middle East is important, but there's also a strong Jewish constituency in Europe. And in 1917, the British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour sent a letter to a Zionist representative, Lord Rothschild, issuing what was called the Balfour Declaration, which essentially said that Britain would view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. All right, so the British go on record as stating that they would support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Okay, so World War I ends, and the major powers, as you recall, go to Versailles for a major peace conference. The Arabs invoke the Hussein-McMahon correspondence saying, hey, you guys promised us independence, and the Jews cited the Balfour Declaration. Once the League of Nations was established, it really didn't do either. It established a system of mandates, a mandatory system. And a mandate quite simply means that a major power has control, a mandate over these old colonial areas. So you can see that the blue area, the French mandates here, Syria, Lebanon, for our purposes, two areas of importance are Iraq and Palestine, both of which become British mandates. Okay, so Britain gets mandatory control at the League of Nations over Palestine and over Iraq. There's a lot more going on, but in the long run, these are the two that we should be concerned with. Once these mandates are established, Jews from Europe, especially from Britain, begin to go into Palestine. The representative, in fact, of the World Zionist Organization in Palestine was David Ben-Gurion. Why is that name familiar? Is anybody? He was Israeli Prime Minister, right. And within the British mandate in Palestine, Jews began to set up an infrastructure, schools and hospitals, businesses, and they also established, very importantly, military groups called Haganah, which would be vitally important in the coming years in the establishment of a Jewish state. More radical Zionists formed what can only be labeled terrorist groups, the best known at the time of which was Irgun, I-R-G-U-N, which was led by somebody else who would become well-known later on, Menachem Begin. Begin was a founder of Irgun. All right, why is Begin known? Why is that name familiar? He would be the prime minister of Israel in the 1970s. Even with this influx of Jews into Palestine, Arabs continued to make up between 80 and 90% of the population, with over 5,600,000. And they are opposed to the British mandate. The roots of what's going on today, if you read the paper today about the Middle East, the roots of it occur in this era. And so we can start talking about, you know, you can pick a date, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, you know, Oslo, Camp David, whatever. But the roots really go back long before that. The Palestinians were furious at the British mandate and the appearance that the British were, in fact, supportive of the creation of a Zionist state, okay? If you talk to Arabs who are politicized, they won't call it a Jewish state, they'll call it a Zionist state. There is a fundamental difference there. The idea of Zionism means that Jews all over the world have a particular homeland in this area, right? This leads, not surprisingly, to intermittent violence between Arabs and Jews in Palestine. And in the late 30s, there was, in fact, a widespread Arab revolt throughout the Middle Eastern region, which was ultimately crushed by force of British arms. So the Arabs really don't like the British, and that's clearly an understatement. Outside of the Middle East, of course, more important things were taking place, namely the Holocaust, which is you know, obviously well known. I mean, the brutal killings of millions of Jews, you know, simply shock the entire world. With this, Zionists decided to take the initiative, and they issued an unequivocal call for a Jewish state. However, the American and British governments didn't want to alienate the Arabs while fighting in World War II. In addition to that, by the 1940s, there are clearly defined and described oil interests, which the United States has to be aware of. And the U.S. Department of State and the British Foreign Office don't want to spoil these oil arrangements, so they're trying to kind of, you know, be very ginger about this issue, you know, address it gingerly. However, the Zionists begin to ramp up their actions. In fact, the Stern Gang, which is another group of terrorists, which includes, I believe, Yitzhak Shamir, who would later become a prime minister of Israel, even assassinated a UN representative, a League of Nations representative who was British. So, you know, clearly a goal of the Zionists is to get rid of this British influence. Within Palestine, throughout World War II, Zionists begin to stockpile weapons. The Irgun, Menachem Begin's group, the Stern Gang, Yitzhak Shamir's group, prepare for what they see as an inevitable war against the Arabs. They begin to steal arms from the British, conduct terrorist activities against the British, bring in refugees. Probably the best known of the Irgun's bombings, which was planned by Menachem Begin, was a 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel, which is where the British were headquartered. It killed over 100 British mandatory officials. So Begin planned this attack on a hotel, okay? We see those all the time. What does the U.S. government call them when Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah does it? It's terrorism, right? So this is one of the major tactics, the major strategies as well of the Zionist in the Middle East. The United States is afraid of being dragged into this conflict, but it will become inevitable. You can kind of see where this is headed. This is 1945. I don't know if you can tell from these circles, but the purple part is Jewish settlement, and the green part is Arab population. So in these major areas, you can see that in basically all of them, it's overwhelmingly Arab. Okay, Arab is kind of green, Jewish is purple. So you can see, you know, like here, Ramallah, almost 100%. You know, Jerusalem, you know, overwhelming. You know, Gaza, Hebron, all the major cities which we still hear about today, overwhelmingly Arab. And in fact, there was still a population of Arabs in Palestine was still somewhere 2/3, 70% region. However, the terrorism keeps mounting. The Jewish attacks, the Zionist attacks on the British keep mounting. So in 1947, Britain, finding it really expensive to keep the peace in Palestine. Remember, Britain at the same time is bailing out of Greece, which leads to the Truman Doctrine. So Britain goes to the United Nations, the new United Nations now with the Palestine issue. The UN decided to terminate the mandate and partition Palestine. Okay, and I don't know again if you can see this very well. This is the 1947 UN partition plan, which would have given the Arabs, I think, 43% of the land, about 4,300 square miles, and given the Jews the rest of the land. Now, the split was clearly angled toward the Zionists, 57% of the land to 43% of the land. At the time, however, Jews lived on about 6 to 8% of the land and about 20% of the arable land. What the UN plan does is actually take the most arable land, the coastal plain, which is the only place where you're going to get any water, and give it to the Zionists. Clearly, then, the Arabs are furious about this. The Jewish area would have 500,000 Jews, but also 400,000 Arabs in it. The Arab area would almost all Arabs. So, what the UN is projecting is an occupied area where Jews would have control over 400,000 Arabs. The United States, the Department of State, initially opposed the partition. George Marshall, the Secretary of State, and military leaders were afraid that if they supported the Zionists, not only would they lose access to oil, but also lose access to those vital sea lanes in that area. Harry Truman supports the creation of Israel. And to this day, there's still, and I've mentioned this before, a huge debate over why. Why does America support Israel so powerfully, so strongly? And, you know, there are probably lots of reasons. One, which is essentially domestically based, argues that the United States is influenced profoundly by a pro-Israel or a Jewish lobby or a Zionist lobby, called those various things. And in fact, Harry Truman in 1947-48 says, "I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs among my constituency." So there is this argument that domestically, American politicians, in particular the Democratic Party, will support Israel in order to get campaign donations and votes and so forth. And clearly Truman was aware of that. There's no question about that. At the time, both Arabs and Jews were putting heavy pressure on the West. Essentially, there's a war going on in Palestine. And in fact, I may have mentioned this before, at the United Nations, Ambassador Warren Austin, while he was observing an Arab and Jewish official argue over Palestine, admonished them. He said, "You guys need to settle this in a true Christian spirit." Muslim Jew, right? I guess they didn't quite do that. At any rate, the conflict continues. The Haganah took the offensive. The Irgun and the Stern Gang conducted raids. Workers and villages were bombed. Finally, the Zionists announced an independent state in May of 1948, and it was recognized by the United States, Soviet Union, and other areas.
Who was leading Palestine at the time? I mean, did they have a government or a military?
One of the problems was that actually Palestine didn't. I mean, basically, King Faisal and I mean the Faisal and his brother, one in Jordan, one in Iraq, and there were just a lot of people speaking for the Palestinians. One of the problems the Palestinians have always had, and the media doesn't cover this much, is not only do they have to deal with Israel, but basically the rest of the Arab world has essentially abandoned them. And this was one of the problems in the 40s. You didn't really have there was not really a Palestinian entity. So all these other Arab leaders are speaking for Palestine in Egypt, in Jordan, in Iraq, in Syria. You know, everybody's speaking for the Palestinians, allegedly.
Because it's just a region basically over there. It's not, you know, it doesn't have any authority at itself, right? I mean, it's like the UN people that are fighting for Palestine.
Well, I mean, they didn't. I mean, you know, the UN could have created a Palestinian state just like it did a Jewish state, but it didn't. So, yeah, use the mic. So, I mean, one of the problems they have is there's really nobody speaking for the Palestinians. You know.
But why didn't they want to have I mean, why didn't they, like, install an official for themselves? I mean.
Well, I mean, you can do that, but I mean, unless the rest of the world recognizes that and is willing to work with you, there's not. I mean, the British still have control. I mean, it's still a British mandate until 1948. So, you know.
So Britain, quote unquote, owns this land.
Right.
Yeah, controls it. Yeah, they occupy. Yeah. So I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, there clearly there was no question that there was a far more support for the Zionists than there ever was for the Palestinians. So it's just very difficult.
Okay, and I have another question. Did you say that when the Jews started to settle down in Palestine or Israel, whatever, they bought the land from them? I mean, you said there was like land purchasers that went over there?
In the early 20th century, yeah.
So they bought their land?
It's about 6% of it. Well, we haven't gotten to that. Yeah. Well, remember, at the time of the proposed UN partition, I just said this, Jews controlled 6 to 8% of the land. Later on, one of the major arguments of the Zionists, Golda Meir and others, would be that Palestine was a land without people for a people without a land. Basically, it was empty, right? That's ridiculous. I mean, these maps, and all these maps, by the way, are from like the UN and CIA. So, man, that's one thing, if you do research on the internet, I mean, it's always dicey. But when I started looking this up, this really got to me, the Middle Eastern stuff, because, boy, you got to be really careful what you use. I mean, you click on something and it's just anyway, be really careful with internet research on the Middle East. But these maps are like CIA and UN or League of Nations maps. So the idea that this was an empty areas is just ridiculous, So there was some land ownership and there was some land purchase, but as of 1947, as I said, 6 to 8%. The UN proposal was to give them 57%. All right? All right. So once Israel declares independence, it continues to conduct this war of expulsion against the Palestinians. And 780,000 out of 1.3 million, which is 60%, of the Arabs were displaced from Palestine in this period. And this area here shows it. This kind of pink in this map here are areas that Israel seized. It took from the Palestinians in 1948 and 1949. By the time this is done, Israel will control 77 to 80% of Palestine. The Palestinians refer to this as Al-Nakba, the cataclysm, right? And there's a good map, and again, it's kind of small here, but you see all those little like dots, those little icons. Those are depopulated villages. Those are Palestinian villages that were, eliminated. That were, the Palestinians were sent into refuge. Right. So only about by the time all this was done, about 150,000 Arabs remained in the Jewish state. So it's clearly a massive migration outward, forced expulsion. In this war, if you want to call it that, the Jews had more guns. They got tons of money funneled in from the United States, from Britain. They had easier supply lines. I mean, they basically didn't have, the other Arab states, which were kind of nominal. And I mean, this is one of the problems. You have the Arab states were kind of supporting the Palestinians, but not really. I mean, the kind of, everyone said, well, how could Israel defeat 22 Arab countries? Well, it's easy because they weren't really supporting the Palestinians. The Palestinians were abandoned by, and I could go into this in great detail tonight. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but Palestine's always been different. Palestinians generally are secular, more secular than much of the Arab world, and more westernized in terms of education and kind of culture. I mean, there's kind of a difference there. So I think that there was always kind of a sense that Arab states were willing to use Palestine for their own ends. But when it came to actually doing something for the Palestinians, did less so, a lot less so. I mean, if you could get something, out of Israel, then, you're willing to abandon the Palestinians. So this conflict continues, and the Arabs don't have the kind of support that the Zionists do. In addition to that, the Zionist attacks continue. King David Hotel, attacks on British officials. A famous event occurred, which is still kind of commemorated today in Palestine in April of 1948. Irgun gangsters, along with the Stern gang, attacked the village of Dar Yassin, which is near Jerusalem, raped the women, killed 250 Arab settlers there. And Menachem Begin referred to their heroic actions. Okay, this Al-Nakba, the cataclysm, continues. Later on, Zionist historians created the story that the Arabs left their homes of their own free will. They simply moved out because they didn't want to live under Jewish rule. However, more recent historians, ironically many of them boasting about Israel's conquest, have shown that the Haganah, the military, destroyed Arab villages and houses like they did at Dar Yassin, spread false stories about cholera and typhus, which sounds familiar. It was a strategy used against Native Americans, right, in the Americas. And they also basically put out word that if you stay, there will be a bloodbath. In addition to that, and this kind of response to your question earlier, in the 30s there were these series of Arab revolts which the British crushed. And when they did that, they basically crushed the infrastructure politically, economically, physically. So there weren't Arab leaders, there weren't Palestinian leaders around. They had been wiped out in the 30s when they rose up against the British. So by 1950, the situation for the Palestinians was quite dire. If you've ever seen, I didn't know this until about a year ago, the keffiyehs that you often see Arabs wearing that have that intricate pattern in them. Those were actually more plain, and then in 1948 they put the pattern to symbolize barbed wire because they were put into refugee camps with barbed wire. So that's what those. So it's really quite and this kind of the al-Nakba, the cataclysm is still something that it's a term quite often used. In the 1950s, this Israeli expansion then occurs. It begins to feud with other Arab states, begins border skirmishes with Syria and Egypt. I don't know if this will show. That's not really a good one. Syria's here, Egypt over here, Sinai Desert there. All right. And in fact, in the mid-50s, Israel began to stage raids against Egypt from the Gaza Strip. And at this point, the leader of Egypt, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, Gamal Abdel Nasser, actually begins setting up training camps for Arab refugees. And these, also a word you've probably become familiar with in the past year or so, these refugee fighters are called Fedayeen, which is what you hear in Iraq all the time, and they begin cross-border raids. So Israel and Egypt are, at odds with each other as well. So there's clearly no stability in that region. What's the U.S. doing? Again, the U.S. is still split, and really you see a kind of a double policy until the 1960s with regard to the Middle East, to Palestine. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Omar Bradley, said, we should not alienate the Arabs by taking a pro-Israel point of view. He said, we would need friendly Arabs all along the Mediterranean for our bases and our lines of communication should we come into conflict in that region. And there's always the fear of some kind of conflict with the Soviet Union. So there's still a strong, if you want to, I don't know if you want to call it pro-Arab, but clearly a more balanced and nuanced view going on. However, push on the button.
How come, you may have already covered this, but why did Britain support Israel so hardcore, like against the Arab nations that were
part of the empire? I mean,
because there wasn't a huge pro-Jewish sentiment in Europe.
No, but I mean, and we talked earlier, why does the U.S. support it? And I think they're very similar. And in the U.S., a lot of people say it's because of the Jewish influence in the U.S. I actually think, that's part of it. But I think the American reason is the same as the British reason, which was that Israel provided a function. They served as kind of a gendarme, to use Chomsky's phrase, for the West. So, I mean, if the British want to maintain control and stability, just as later the Americans want to maintain control and stability, rather than do it yourself, get Israel to do it for you. So it's important in that regard to have a state. I mean, the British know the Arabs don't like them. I mean, Britain knows the Arabs hate them, right? So you need somebody there. And ironically, I mean, the Jews don't want them there either. I mean, the King David attacks and all this, these were committed by Zionist groups, Stern and Ergun. So. But Britain kind of gets it in 47. It can't afford it. Its people are getting killed. They go to the UN. They're ready to bail out, which doesn't mean that they're willing to give up. You'll see that obviously in October of 1956 at Suez. As far as the United States goes, I mean, you have on one hand you have people like Bradley who are saying oil is important. These lines of communication are important. In addition to that, the CIA recognized Israel's going to be a problem. It's going to be an issue. The CIA in 1953 says Israel already has too many people. They've been assimilated too rapidly. They have no natural resources. They have very little money of their own. Most of their income, most of their budget comes from foreign loans, especially from the United States. So they understand, too, that they are committed to a policy of territorial expansion, and that will bring on Arab hostility. None of this is surprising. Everybody knows it. The CIA sees it. Everybody else sees it coming. So the United States then, by the early 50s, clearly is aware of what's happening in the Middle East, and it's also aware that there will be more to come later. Switch a little bit. There's another issue going on which plays into one of the other major issues, of course, oil. I won't talk about oil specifically that much because it's kind of there. It's all over the place. Oil's important. And if we start to do that, it could be, amazingly intricate. But Iran clearly fits into that. There's certainly more to deal with than Israel in the Middle East. And of course, the biggest factor is oil, petroleum. By 1944, American companies owned 42% of the oil reserves of the Middle East, which was a massive increase of 19-fold just since 1936. So they went from, whatever 19-fold of 1900% of 4,200 is. What is that? That's less than it's about 2%. They go from like 2 or 3% to 42% in just 8 years. So there's this massive increase in American oil interest in the Middle East. By 1955, American companies were producing over 50% of the oil from that region and providing Europe with over 90% of its oil imports. So the point here, which I don't have to belabor, everybody knows it, everybody who puts gas in their SUV or whatever knows, is that Middle Eastern oil is important. Enough said. Iran is really important in that regard, and it becomes one of the first crises of the Cold War. And the Middle East is always going to be an important area in the Cold War too. This U.S.-Soviet confrontation. During the war, Iran had been. Here's Iran. This, back in the day, would have been the Soviet Union before 1990. I couldn't find a map that was actually breakup. So just pretend that says USSR up there, okay? Iran shared a border, and during the war had been jointly occupied by the Americans, British, and Russians. Once the war is over, Iran becomes vitally important to the United States. Why? Harry Truman says the loss of Iranian oil would be a serious loss for the economy of the Western world. Those aren't small stakes, the economy of the Western world. The U.S. ambassador to Tehran said the United States had to go in and establish influence over Iran because if the Russians did it, it would create a potential threat to our immensely rich oil holdings in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Kuwait. So Iran is important with regard to oil. What were the Soviet goals in Iran? New documents actually, ironically, indicate that the Soviet Union was putting pressure on local communists in Iran to essentially create New Deal type programs, education and infrastructure and things like that. The U.S. didn't see it that way. They essentially used coercion, political coercion against the Soviet Union. They went to the United Nations and got the Soviet Union to back down. It's one of the first, really the first conflict of the Cold War revolves around Middle East and oil, right? But that doesn't solve the so-called Iranian problem. Although the Western states, the United States, have huge influences in Iran, the Iranians aren't that happy with it. The biggest oil firm in Iran was the AIOC, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was actually British-owned. Nationalist Iranians hated the AIOC, which was a clear symbol of Western imperialism. And one of the leaders of the political opposition at the time was a man named Mohammad Mossadegh. This is a fairly familiar story, so I'll go through it fairly quickly. The nationalists form a front led by Mossadegh, and they begin to challenge the British-owned oil company. In 1950, for instance, the oil company, the AIOC, earned profits in the range of 200 million pounds, which would probably be nearly $1 billion. And Iran received only 8% of that in royalties. In fact, the AIOC's profits in 1950 alone exceeded all the money Iran had made in the previous 50 years combined. All right? And in fact, Iran was receiving less money in royalties than it had to pay the British back in taxes. In 1948, 49, and 50, the Iranians received respectively 9, 13.5, and 16 million pounds in royalties. During those same 3 years that they were receiving 9, 13.5, and 16 million pounds, they paid in taxes 28 million, 23 million, and 50 million pounds. So their tax burden was over double their royalty income. Having just filed my W-2, I'm somewhat familiar with that. And in fact, the British, the ALC, wouldn't even let the Iranian officials come in and examine the books to verify them. In 1950, Mossadegh's group, this front, which is part of the Congress, the Majlis, issues forth a call for nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian oil company. You know what nationalization is, right? It means you take it over, and then you give them, due compensation for the appropriation. What do the British and the Americans think of that? Obviously, they don't like it. The British, the Secret Intelligence Service, goes to the CIA and talks about coordinating a coup against Mossadegh. In fact, when Dwight Eisenhower becomes president in 1953, he says Iran is important. It's like one of the most important issues. Eisenhower says, if I had $500 million of money to spend in secret, I would get at least $100 million of it to Iran right now. Instead, he sends the CIA, led by Kermit Roosevelt, who was a grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, to Tehran, and they begin to put pressure on Mossadegh. They conduct essentially a psychological operations coup against him. They start putting radio transmissions out that Mossadegh is, and well, first they issue all this propaganda. Mossadegh was kind of a character. He used to greet visitors in his, he became prime minister. He used to greet visitors in his pajamas, and he would weep. He would give these emotional speeches, and so everybody started, he's crazy, he's effeminate, this and that. So they begin this kind of propaganda attack on him, and put out these like radio transmission signals that he was under attack, and so finally Mossadegh bails. He bolts. He wanted to avert bloodshed, so he leaves. I mean, Mossadegh, it's kind of funny because what did the U.S. say about him? How did they discredit him? Not only was he nuts and he wept, but he was a communist, right? Because he was trying to nationalize oil. So, which is really ironic. Mossadegh came from one of the most established, well-known bourgeois liberal families in all of Iran. I mean, the idea of him being a communist. Ultimately, he does find support in the Tudeh party, the Communist Party, because he was besieged. He was clearly under attack by 1953. So, long story short, the CIA gets rid of Mossadegh and puts into power the Shah of Iran, who will be there for a quarter century. So, American oil interests clearly are safe after 1953. The long-term consequences, the long-term harm, of course, of 1953, will become evident in 1978 and thereafter, okay? So, the Cold War, is in full flight, and it's not taking place just in Europe. It's not just between the U.S. and Soviet Union. It's in the Middle East, too. It's in Israel, it's in Palestine, it's in Iran, and it's going to get even bigger in the early 1950s with the emergence of a new leader in Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser. And again, if you have any questions, just ask. Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser took over in a coup against the monarchy of King Farouk and established a nationalist regime. Nasser was an advocate of modernization, of nationalism, of technology, of advance. And initially, the U.S. is somewhat encouraged by the coup. However, Nasser, as a nationalist, immediately says to the British, we want you to abandon your military bases in the Suez Canal. All right, so Nasser puts the British on notice that Egypt will, run itself, that it will be sovereign. He declares that he will a policy of what he calls positive neutrality. He says, I'm not going to be part of the U.S. or the Soviet camp. And in fact, and I think I've mentioned this before, along with people like Jawaharlal Nehru and Sukarno, actually form a non-aligned movement. This leads to the famous conference at Bandung in 1955, where they issue these proclamations of neutrality. At the same time, however, in 1955, the Americans don't buy that. You can't be neutral for Washington, D.C. You have to be, you're either with us or against us. You know, when George Bush said that, you know, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, that's nothing new, right? So in 1955, the U.S. establishes something called the Baghdad Pact, which is essentially a response to Arab nationalism, ironically in the capital of Iraq. And this includes Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and the Americans and the British, and maybe somebody else. And it's essentially a security pact, a joint defense pact, which will, in which the countries, the signatory countries, will defend each other. And defend each other against whom? Who is the enemy? The Soviet Union. And beyond that, the unspoken assumption is that the enemy is Nasser, right? And Nasser, in fact, goes off. He says, I'm tired of this hammering for pacts. It'll only keep alive old suspicions of Western imperialism. So Nasser believes it's directed at him. The U.S. clearly doesn't like Nasser. It doesn't like this concept of Arab nationalism. At the same time, though, it understands that there is a battle raging in the third world and that the U.S. can't be too heavy-handed. So the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, actually goes to Nasser and tries to seduce him and offers him $1 billion, both from the United States and from the World Bank, to build an irrigation dam, a dam on the Aswan River for irrigation and electricity, the Aswan High Dam. So the United States and the World Bank are going to give Egypt $1 billion for this Aswan Dam project. However, it doesn't go very far. In the United States, two groups in Congress are immediately furious and step in to kill this. Who would they be? One is pretty obvious. I mean, both of them are actually kind of obvious. One, who would be against Egyptian development? Israel. Israel, and who would the other one be? What does Egypt produce more than anything else? Cotton. So who would be against it? Cotton State reps, right. So immediately there's this attack. In addition to that, so already the writing's on the wall that the Americans don't want Egypt to get this development aid. Nasser, who is independent, recognizes the People's Republic of China, and so Dulles withdraws the offer. Dulles says, you're not getting the money. All right, and Nasser issues forth one of my favorite insults of all time: "May you choke to death on your fury." Nasser is a hero in the third world. I mean, this is kind of, the U.S. runs the risk. You know, it has this incredible power and hegemony, but remember, there are limits to that. You can have all the weapons in the world, and you can go in and crush people, but the U.S., when it does that and when it uses these mechanisms, and withdrawing or offering financial aid is every bit as powerful and potent as using guns and bombs. When you can offer $1 billion and then pull it back, you know, that gives you real power. That's juice. And when the United States withdraws that, it becomes the real object of enmity. I mean, they're involved in a war, right? In the third world, this political war. That's what the Cold War is. And so, you know, the third world, the non-aligned world, the Indonesians and the Indians and the Egyptians of the world look upon the U.S. now with great fear and suspicion, right? And so this is a huge setback, and Nasser compounds it. In July, he announces that he will nationalize the Suez Canal. And the Suez, one of these maps, this is a really big one, but that's okay. This is the Gulf of Suez. This is the canal which leads to the Mediterranean, okay? Nasser, in July of 1956, announces that he is going to take it over from the British. The British ran the Suez Canal company. You can imagine how this is, how this goes over in Europe and in the United States. They're furious. Not only is it vital for military deployments, but what else goes through the Suez Canal? Oil. Right. So the British and French immediately want to take military action against Nasser. However, ironically, Dulles is the voice of reason. Dulles, throughout the entire Suez crisis, was always cautioning against this. Is it because he liked Nasser? Because he despised Nasser. He despised Nasserism, but he was afraid that the Soviet Union would reap the benefit of this. That in fact Nasser might even invite Khrushchev to intervene, and that America's credibility, America's oil interest in the entire region would be jeopardized. So Dulles has to go slow. The British The French and the Israelis don't, however, and in late October, Israel strikes across the Sinai and advances toward Suez. This is the Sinai here. This is Israel, okay? Advances toward Suez. At the same time, the British and French begin to attack Egyptian airfields with their own bombers. Eisenhower and Dulles are furious. This was done without American cooperation, without coordination, or without even information about it. Dulles publicly condemns the British and the French. In fact, at the United Nations, on November 1st, the attacks were on October 29th. On November 1st, Dulles goes to the United Nations General Assembly and says, Egypt is guilty of provocations, but they cannot justify the resort to armed force which has occurred. This is really striking. I mean, we're talking about today's, the breakdown in America's alliances under George Bush, which are really just stunning. The loss of credibility, the loss of influence is really quite stunning. But I mean, think of this. The Secretary of State goes to the United Nations and publicly attacks the British and the French, which is really quite strident as well. Dulles essentially uses America's political power and the weight of the UN to force a British and French withdrawal. The British and French are basically dead in the Middle East at that point. They no longer have the influence, the connections, and the credibility they did. The Americans are now the major superpower in that region, and who else is now a player in that region? The Soviet Union. The Soviet Union makes out great because for almost no investment, they are now a player in that region, simply because if you don't want the United States operating its hegemony against you, what can you do? You have to find another patron, and it's the Soviet Union. As a result of that, as a result of Suez, Eisenhower, just shortly after that, announces the Eisenhower Doctrine, which essentially says that the United States will be willing to support any country in the Middle East which, and with the use of armed force if necessary, any country in the Middle East which may be, under the control of international communism, which may have communist influences there. So Eisenhower takes a regional conflict based upon two major factors, right? One, with regard to Suez, is Western colonialism. The other is Zionism, and he turns it into a conflict based on communism. That wasn't the issue. Communism was never terribly popular in the Middle East. There were Marxists in the Middle East. There were communist parties in the Middle East. They were never terribly popular. In fact, Nasser outlawed the Egyptian Communist Party. They clearly were aware that Zionism and Western imperialism were the issues there, but those didn't play to America's overall strategic objectives. So they turned it into a Cold War conflict. And the Eisenhower Doctrine says, we will go into the Middle East and we will take action because the specter of international communism is so great, threatening these vital interests, and we have to do something about it. And you actually see that at play a year later in Lebanon. Lebanon actually had more or less a client government. Lebanon is the most religiously diverse area. And it was led by a Christian named Camille Chamoun, who was basically a CIA, I don't want to call him a stooge, but he was basically a CIA stooge. But one of these guys who really wasn't doing what the Americans wanted him to do, outlawing other parties, really kind of bad form. So Eisenhower tries to get Chamoun to cool it, to kind of put on the veneer of democracy, and he won't do it. Chamoun is so unpopular that you start to see street demonstrations against him, right? Why is that? Because the guy's a stooge, right? However, when the U.S. sees young students and activists and union organizers in the streets of Lebanon, what does it suggest? What does it say? Who's doing that? The communists are behind it. So what does Eisenhower do? He sends 14,000 Marines ashore in Lebanon. They actually come on the beach, sunbathers, guys selling hummus, people playing beach ball, volleyball, and the Marines, there's pictures of it. It's really quite striking. What do? They restore order. In this case, they actually get rid of Camille Chamoun because he may be, a stooge, but he's not a very good one. But the point here was that under this guise of international communism, which was absurd, Eisenhower reserves the right now to go in and take action. Okay. Now, what this means and this is in 1958, is that the United States has lost a significant amount of, I mean, the United States won World War II, right? They defeated the Nazis. They helped decolonize India. Franklin Roosevelt spoke about decolonization and the Declaration of Independence, and George Washington. The U.S. had always been this kind of beacon, this city on a hill. You know all the rhetoric. You grew up with it, right? Well, the world ain't seeing it that way anymore. And by the later 1950s, there is this real resurgence in anti-Americanism. In 1950, Dean Acheson sent a memo out to his diplomatic officials in the Middle East. And the memo's title is Anti-Americanism in the Arab World. This is May 1st, 1950, ironically May Day, right? And Acheson reports, anti-Americanism is resurging in the Arab world. Recent bombings, vitriolic public statements by high officials, diatribes and fantastic rumors all testify to the rekindling of Arab animosity against the United States. Colin Powell could have written that 3 days ago, right? He could have written that this morning. And this is on May 1st, 1950. Anti-Americanism is resurging in the Arab world. Recent bombings, vitriolic public statements by high officials, diatribes and fantastic rumors all testify to the rekindling of Arab animosity against the United States. Acheson says, whether prompted by Muslim extremists or whether attributable to a sincere objection to America's part in Palestine developments, such ill will bodes no good for the interest of the United States. May 1st, 1950. He's talking about Muslim extremism, Palestine, anti-Americanism, bombings, vitriolic public statements, fantastic rumors, and diatribes. Right? You'll read that in the paper. You open the paper this morning, you'll see the exact same thing. In 1952, the Department of State, in an analysis of the Middle East, said that there was a widespread suspicion of foreigners and a widespread feeling against the United States because of Israel. And because of that, you can't really have any kind of frank and open relationship with Arab leaders. In 1954, the National Security Council, this is a year after the Mossadegh coup, the National Security Council studies the Middle East and says that conditions and trends in the Middle East are, quote, inimical to Western interests. All right? Nations of the Middle East, this is the National Security Council, are suspicious of outside interests in their affairs. The Arab nations are incensed by what they believe to be our pro-Israel policy. 1954. In 1956, after the U.S. reneges on its funding proposal for Aswan, there is incredible anti-American hostility throughout the Arab world, right? So this is clearly quite profound, and you see it a couple years later in Iraq. This is our introduction to another area of great importance, Iraq. Remember, Iraq was part of the British mandate. The British got a mandate in Iraq in 1920. And in fact, the British in Iraq are famous maybe for a few things, but one in particular. It is the first recorded use of a widespread air war campaign against civilians. There was an uprising in Iraq, and so the British Royal Air Force sent the fighters out, and they dropped gas shells and explosions on Iraqis and killed 9,000 people in 1921 or 22. All right? So the British have influence in Iraq. They killed, actually they killed Kurds as well. So the Iraqis are well aware of what Western imperialism means. Iraq was led by a British emplaced monarch, King Faisal, who was a very reliable ally of the British and ultimately the United States. And in fact, Faisal was a signatory to the Baghdad Pact, which took place in his capital. However, Nasserism is very powerful, and there is a group of military officers in Iraq led by a general named Abdel Karim Qasim, who get rid of King Faisal in 1958. On July 14th, 1958, ironically, it occurs at the same time as the Lebanon crisis, and this is one of the reasons Eisenhower finds it really important to send troops in, because what he sees in Iraq, he doesn't like. I believe they kill Faisal. I could be mistaken on that. So Karim Qasim takes over. He is a nationalist. He is a Nasserite. And Karim Qasim actually begins, this is ironic, a repression of a lot of the leftist groups in Iraq, the socialists and the communists, including a young Ba'ath Party official named Saddam Hussein. And Saddam actually went into exile in Egypt during the Karim Qasim years. However, in 1963, the Ba'ath Party got rid of Qasim and assassinated him. Between 1963, for about a half decade, there was a repression where the Ba'ath Party essentially liquidated its political rivals on the left. And in fact, the United States Central Intelligence Agency worked closely with Ba'athists to identify leftists who should be purged. And Saddam emerges out of this as a player in Iraqi politics.
Did the U.S. have anything to do with the assassination of Qasim? Yeah.
No, that was internal. That was the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath was part of a coalition that assassinates Karim, and then slowly, basically eliminates its rivals with the help of the CIA. The point being here is that the U.S. was on comfortable terms with the Baathists in the 60s. This was never a left-wing party. The Baathists, never were. They killed the socialists. They wiped out the labor organizers and people like that, right? So, any questions? Grab a gulp here. So clearly, then, what you see is a Cold War in the Middle East with intermittent bouts of hot war. Through coups in Iraq, through a confrontation at Suez, an intervention in Lebanon, a coup in Iraq, a couple coups in Iraq. So a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and the U.S. is deeply involved in an increasingly hostile region. Yeah.
A lot of this comes from just like in Africa, where Europeans just drew some lines on the map, and it had nothing to do with actual tribes.
Yeah, the mandate system, yeah. I mean, the mandatory system was you had national entities there, but clearly, I mean, the mandatory system, the League of Nations went to the Middle East and said, yeah, we'll create a border here. I mean, Kuwait was artificially created that way. Kuwait was part of Iraq. I mean, Saddam was right about that. So yeah, there's no question, I mean, that these borders were essentially crafted by League of Nations officials, by the Europeans. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this, is going to be hard to resolve. I mean, Palestine's the best example of that, right? I mean, the League of Nations said, well, we're going to give you 57%, you 43%. That did not in any way, correspond to the reality of the situation, either in terms of population or land ownership. If it had, then the Arabs would have gotten 2/3 of Palestine. In fact, the Zionists did, and they took a bunch more. So, yeah, I mean, these are all, and this is one of the problems. And that's why I said the root of this, which you have to understand, goes back to this period. I mean, what's going on today, really has to, be looked at in the longue durée, as the French would say. So there's clearly a Cold War in the Middle East. The United States has issues after Suez with the Egyptians, with Iraq after the Karim Qasim coup, with Syria, which actually forms a Ba'athist party and actually merges with Egypt as the United Arab Republic. So the United States increasingly sees the Middle East as part of the Cold War. But again, as I said a few minutes ago, that wasn't the issue. Communism wasn't the issue in the Middle East. What was? Zionism, Western imperialism, Zionism especially. And so the United States continues to have disputes with other states in the region. Now, the United States bought itself some goodwill by repudiating the invasion at Suez. That, however, was short-lived. For instance, the United States did force a withdrawal of the Europeans. At the same time, it refused to supply medical aid for Egyptians who were attacked by Western aircraft at Port Said. So the U.S. refuses humanitarian aid. It suspended a CARE program, which was sending food, lunches to school kids in Egypt. It took part in a Western boycott of Egypt and refused to sell wheat, which refused to sell wheat and oil. So the Soviet Union sees a vacuum here, and this is when you start to see real Soviet involvement. It begins to support initially the Ba'athist parties in Iraq and Syria. Syria in particular, I won't talk much about that. Syria had some real issues with Israel over water, which is another issue that's really as important as oil, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Israel wanted to divert water from the Jordan River, and Syria took issue with that and actually began to fire on Israel from the border they share at the Golan Heights. This water diversion scheme actually gives impetus to a pan-Arab meeting in 1964, out of which emerges what today is still the best-known Palestinian group, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, emerges out of this water diversion crisis. There was a more militant group at the time called Al-Fatah, and Al-Fatah was led by a young engineer named Yasser Arafat, and I believe in 1966 they merged. And Syria, I believe, was the first group to fund the PLO and al-Fatah. Syria, but the point that's important is that Syria's border issue and water issues with Israel are increasing tensions. And so Syria and Egypt talk and decide to sign a joint defense pact. In November of 1966, Israel takes military action into Jordan, and the United Nations condemned that. So the Arab states are talking, and they want to do something about Israel. Nasser, after 1956, was reluctant to do that, even though he didn't lose Suez. He understood that there was a great price to pay. The British, French, and Israelis came after him. So Nasser is going slow, but at the same time, Nasser believes that the United States was using Israel to get at him, that ultimately the U.S. goal was to get back at him for Suez, and it would use Israel to do it. This is the gendarme, the cop on the beat strategy. We don't want to do it ourselves. We'll get Israel to do it for us. So Nasser decides to start talking about preemptive action, gets Syria and Iraq and Jordan to mobilize. Egypt closes the Gulf of, wrong. Don't worry about it. Closes the Gulf of Aqaba. I don't know if you remember that the Gulf of Aqaba was on the eastern side of the Suez. So Israel sees itself increasingly surrounded by Arab armies mobilizing, so it decides to preempt. And on June 5th, 1967, Israel attacked. It struck via air power against Egypt's air force and wiped out much of Egypt's air force, preemptive attack. Its ground troops seized the Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula. There's Gaza. This is the Sinai, which belonged to Egypt. This is also during the time during which the Israelis attacked an American ship, the USS Liberty. Some of you may have heard of that. It's kind of a real big issue for conspiracy buffs. I think there's actually something to it. It's not just a conspiracy. There was an American intelligence gathering ship, the USS Liberty, which was attacked by Israel, killed, I think, 34 Americans. Israel said, we're sorry, claimed it was a mistake. LBJ accepted that. A lot of military people, including Thomas Moore, who was the chief of naval operations at the time, believed that it was done on purpose, that the U.S. was actually conducting surveillance on Israel and finding out some stuff that Israel didn't want the U.S. to know, and so it attacked on purpose. At any rate, the Israelis take Gaza and the Sinai. Jordan, over here, on the east, joins the war, and when they do that, Israel takes the West Bank, East Jerusalem. Jerusalem was an international city, and the Golan Heights area. And there's the West Bank, there's Gaza, here's Golan Heights in Syria. All right. This is Greater Israel, and this is still a cause of the cause. There's another view with red and blue. The red is the area seized. June 10th, 6 days later, the war is over, and Israel has gained 28,000 square miles and is 3 times larger than it was in 1949. It has more defensible borders, what it calls strategic depth. And 1.3 million Palestinians are now under Israeli control. This is the point at which the U.S. really throws in its lot with Israel. It had always been pro-Israel, but in 1967, Johnson recognized that the Arab states were no match for the Israelis. Israel had overwhelming efficiency and competency, a strong air force, and so Johnson begins to carve out what's called a special relationship. Do you have a question? Do you have a thing there to push? Or?
Is this the time when Israeli armor units had the Suez closed down, they had been pushing armor units across, and the U.S. made them stop because they didn't want to bring the Soviets anymore?
That's always a concern, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Israel stunned the entire Arab world with the efficiency and the ease with which it really did. I mean, if you look at the stats, the Arabs probably, if you combine them all, had more firepower. But Israel already had a really sizable army, tanks, aircraft, and training, and just really overwhelmed the Arab armies. It was massive humiliation for the Arabs. They couldn't believe it. And the U.S. begins this special relationship. Once the hostilities are ended, the United Nations gets into the act and passes Resolution 242. This is still on the books today. 242 and 338, which I'll talk about in a minute, are still the operative resolutions with regard to the Middle East. 242 says Israel has to return the occupied territories. And it says all states have to live in peace within secure and recognized borders. And it basically is saying that the Arab states have to recognize Israel's right to exist. Remember, the Arab states do not consider Israel a real state. They do not recognize Israel. They have economic boycotts against Israel. Israel was a creation of the United Nations. It was based on land taken from Palestinians. This is the fundamental issue. This is what I say. It goes back to something as simple as this. The Arabs do not recognize Israel as a viable state. And you always hear people kind of mock that. Hey, for 30 years, the United States didn't recognize China as a real country. It took them 16 years to recognize the Soviet Union. This is what happens in international politics. So basically what 242 is saying is Israel's got to give that land back. Gaza, the Sinai, the West Bank, Golan Heights, East Jerusalem. But in return, it has to be recognized as a legitimate state with secure borders. The Arabs won't do that. That would run counter to everything they believe in. That would run counter to the entire, Palestinian existence. The Palestinians don't have a state of their own. The Zionists do. So Israel, when 242 is passed, there's a controversy over it because Israel says recognition, borders, and peace has to precede any withdrawal. We're not going to give back these occupied territories until you first, hold up your end of the bargain. And you can kind of see some of the consequences of 67. All right, the dark black charcoal kind of icons here are refugee camps. These are residential areas, and these little triangles, green triangles, are Israeli settlements. This is in Gaza. All right. That's the one I just had. Oh. Okay, here's the West Bank and Gaza. You can see a very sizable part of Israel, and you can see here the Israeli settlements here. I mean, look, this is the West Bank. This is 1967, so you can see the tremendous takeover of Palestinian land. When we say settlements, I mean, this isn't like, some developer coming in and tearing trees down. Basically, these settlements they're removing Palestinians. They're physically removing Palestinian villagers and villages and homes. It's the same thing you see today. In the past 2 or 3 years, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have simply gone in and bulldozed about 4,000 Palestinian homes. So this isn't, like, please leave, you have 48 hours to get out, It's not like your landlord telling you your lease is up at the end of the month. It's physical destruction, right? So Israel says we'll only accept 242 if the Arab states recognize our right to exist within secure borders, and the Arabs say no peace, no negotiations, no recognition with Israel. The Arab masses, the so-called Arab street, really rises up at this time. You see a real emergence, a real surge in Arab nationalism. The consequences of the Six-Day War are quite great. Soviet aid increases to anti-Israeli states, to Egypt, to Syria, especially to Egypt, where the Soviet Union begins to send in significant weapons caches and advisors. Israel expelled Palestinians from the occupied territories, 500,000 in Sinai and Gaza, 800,000 in the West Bank are now under Israeli occupation. The Six-Day War and the Israeli-Palestine dispute are the pivot point of Middle East politics, in some ways of global politics. The Soviet Union, as I said, was sending increasing aid to Egypt. The United States sent 50 F-4 Phantom jets to Israel. Between 1971 and 73, the U.S. sent $1.2 billion in arms to Israel. Israel begins to annex more Palestinian land in Gaza, in Sinai. Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, calls it creating facts, basically making fait accompli. We'll go in, we'll take the land, we'll take the settlements. It's a fact. We have it. Clearly, Israel has the upper hand in the Middle East, and everybody else is kind of responding and on the defensive. Egypt, however, still smarts from 1967. Nasser dies in 1970 and is replaced by Anwar Sadat. And Sadat believes, and Egypt has a lot of problems, does today, economic, political. Sadat believes the key to a revival in Egypt is to restore the land and credibility it had lost in 1967. In addition to that, Sadat actually begins to distrust the Soviet Union. And Sadat, in 1972, kicks out Soviet military advisors. Now, the United States is saying that the Middle East is part of the Cold War, yet Anwar Sadat is booting out all these Soviet military advisors. And in a sense, it makes the Americans breathe easier, because they're saying, well, if he's getting the Soviets out, then he has no aggressive intentions. In fact, Sadat kicked the Soviet advisors out in order to become more aggressive, because the Soviet Union was actually a barrier to Egyptian military action. So, I mean, the U.S. and Soviet Union are essentially playing the same game in the Middle East. The Russians were an impediment to an Egyptian war against Israel. So once the Soviet Union is eliminated from the picture, Sadat begins preparing for a war of retaliation. Egypt planned a two-front war, getting Syria involved in the north so that they could get the Golan Heights back, and getting themselves involved with an attack across the Sinai. Even though the Soviet military advisors were kicked out, Soviet military equipment continued to flow into Cairo, including Scud, surface-to-surface missiles. This is happening at the same time that Nixon and Brezhnev are talking détente. It's kind of like Vietnam. Remember when the Vietnamese essentially felt sold down the river because of détente? Sadat fears the same thing, that if the Americans and Soviet are cooking this deal up, then he'll become, kind of ancillary to it all. So he gets, kind of takes preemptive action, gets the Soviets out of there, and plans for a war against Israel. This takes place in October of 1973. depending on which side of the street you live on, you can call it either the Ramadan or the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria attacked on October 6th, the Ramadan for the Muslims, Yom Kippur for Jews. Egypt crossed the Suez Canal into Sinai. Syria attacked in the north from the Golan Heights. The Arabs actually struck by surprise, overwhelmed the Israelis, and actually recovered the pre-1967 borders. The Soviet Union was aiding the Arab attacks. However, Richard Nixon came to the rescue and turned the tide. Nixon actually got C-5 transport planes, which are massive transport planes, and began sending round-the-clock resupply missions to Israel. Nixon said that support of Israel was the most efficient way to maintain Middle East security. Break now.